All right, welcome back. This is part two of Research Methods in General Psychology. This is Professor Pelham as usual, and we're going to pick up where I left off in the last lecture when I talked about John Stuart Mills's rules for understanding causality. And we're going to talk about a research technique that's been around now for going on 90 years that resolves all of those issues or answers all those questions. So we're going to talk about a research technique that gives you information about covariation, that gives you good information about temporal sequence, what happened when, and that gets rid of every imaginable confound if you can imagine that. But before we do that, let's hear from a guest speaker here. This is Dexter, and you all might be young enough that Dexter had disappeared from Cartoon Network by the time you were a kid, but even my son Lincoln, who's 17, has seen Dexter a little bit. Dexter loves science and says things like this all the time. Let's see if we can hear from Dexter.
What a fine day for science!
And it is a fine day for science if you follow R.A. Fisher's experimental paradigm and conduct research, whether it's in psychology or sociology or particle physics. If you do experimental research, that involves living beings like people or plants, then you can find out a lot about causality in a really efficient, pretty clever way. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about Fisher's main tool. R.A. Fisher took things that ideas that people had come up from multiple areas and wove them together and clarified them, solidified them. But the tool that's central to his book, his most famous book that he wrote in 1932-ish, I think it was, is the experiment. He talked about the experiment and how to do it right, whether you're dealing with plants or people. And if you're going to do an experiment, the most crucial ingredient to saying you did one is to use a technique called random assignment. I'm guessing the definition of random assignment I'm giving you here is a little bit different than the one that I give in the textbook because I tweaked it a little bit. I've tried to make it a little bit shorter, but our definition, Pelham and Blanton, that you I hope have read already, is if you use random assignment, you give all participants the same chances, the same odds of receiving any possible treatment. So in a simple study with just two experimental conditions, a drug condition and a placebo condition, you would have a 50% chance of getting the drug or getting the placebo. If you were going to be working in a hot room or a cool room, to see if working in the hot room made you lose your temper more easily, there's a 50% chance you'd go in the hot room and a 50% chance you could go in the cool room. Cool room. If there were three conditions in an experiment, of course, you would have a 33.33% chance of going into any one condition, regardless of your gender, regardless of your age, regardless of your political orientation. It's done by the flip of a coin. It's done by a random number table. It's done in ways that are completely arbitrary, and that turns out to be a very good thing. Okay, so you put people in the conditions of your experiment, if you do a real experiment, completely arbitrarily, without regard to whether you like them, how tall they are, what their skin tone is like. It's completely random. Okay, when you do that, when you've conducted an experiment, whether it's in the lab or in the field, if you've conducted a true experiment, you've identified something that you'll call your independent variable, that's in yellow here, and you've identified something, the outcome, the consequence that you call your dependent variable. And I hope it's pretty clear that the dependent variable is called the dependent variable because it depends on, sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but it does depend on the independent variable. It might seem a little bit weird to call the causal variable the independent variable, but it is in fact independent of everything about the people in the study, independent of gender, independent of ethnicity, independent of age, independent of shoe size, independent of everything. And if it's independent of everything, the only thing that's going on there is whether you got the elixir or not, whether you met a friendly researcher or a rude researcher, whether you're given a lot of time pressure or very little time pressure to do an activity. So every experiment in psychology and every experiment that deals with people or animals or plants, any place, has an independent variable and a dependent variable. And you're going to see, now this is a pretty unusual experiment. It's a within subjects experiment. I think you got to read about that. But Professor Frink here, I haven't watched The Simpsons in a couple of decades. I need to catch up on that. Professor Frink, I think it is here, is going to take the elixir, and we're going to see that it has a very powerful consequence.
I doubt very highly that one elixir could boast so many fantastic properties.
Okay, so he's taking it.
Let's say we amscray out of here and have a wild wingding at the cyclotron, Doctor.
Anything you say, Professor. Whoa.
Okay, so you can see that he was the very geeky, nerdy Professor Frink. He drinks the elixir, and apparently immediately he becomes a cool, suave, if maybe a little bit sexist dude. But now they both have their PhDs. She's not his student, so it's a little bit of a wacky example, but you can see here in a pretty colorful way that he is one kind of person, and after he drinks the elixir, he's a very different kind of person. There is no such elixir, or I would have taken it a long time ago, of course. But if there were such an elixir, the elixir would be the independent variable, the causal variable, and then his level of suaveness, handsomeness, coolness, whatever you want to call it, would be the dependent variable in that particular example. And again, that's easy to remember because the dependent variable depends on the independent variable, which depends on nothing except the random flip of a coin or a random number generator, for example. All right, so that's IV and DV. We often abbreviate them IV, DV, independent, dependent, and we're talking about them because we're talking about experiments and random assignment. Okay, I'm going to give you some more examples. Some of these are wacky and technical and ridiculous, and of course, unless you go to graduate school in psychopharmacology or some other discipline, you're not going to care about some of these, but I'm just showing you that no matter what the variables are, it's pretty easy to identify an independent variable and a dependent variable. Excuse me, sorry. These are the titles, I think they're all titles of real studies. I got these off Web of Science, I believe. A study to evaluate the effect of rosuvastatin, hope I'm saying it right, on ... coronary atheroma burden. Okay, so a study to evaluate the effect of that drug on this cardiac outcome. And I hope it's pretty clear to you. We're going to color code these. That rosuvastatin is the independent variable. It has an effect. It's the driving causal agent, and the consequence is this heart health outcome. Okay, so that's one. Do cats really behave erratically in response to catnip? The answer is they do. And in fact, if you ever go to Africa and you get lost from your safari group, you should probably keep some catnip with you and a vacuum cleaner with you, because like cats, like house cats, lions love catnip, and they might even be afraid of vacuum cleaners. I'm not sure of that one, but yes, all cats, big cats and small cats, love catnip. It freaks them out. It sort of makes them high. And so, yes, they do behave erratically. I'm sure there are some cats who are relatively immune to it, but yes, catnip makes cats crazy and happy. Okay, if we know that, the independent variable, of course, is the catnip, right? Let's check. Yeah. And the outcome, the dependent variable, is behaving erratically. However, you could define that by how much they move, by how predictable they are. Any way you want to define it, that's the outcome. Okay, the effects of physical assault and the risk of developing PTSD. The assault is the independent variable. That happened, unfortunately. The outcome, at least some of the time, unfortunately, is PTSD. Now, of course, being physically assaulted doesn't make everyone have PTSD, or I would have had PTSD 1,000 times as a kid from being assaulted by my much stronger brother. And I do mean assaulted, not just beaten up a little, but that's what kids did when I was growing up. But being physically assaulted, especially as an adult in a serious way, does increase your risk of developing PTSD. It doesn't guarantee it, thankfully, but it does play a causal role. All right, and one more I think we got here. The development of scabies, I'm getting itchy just thinking about it, after exposure to the human itch mite. I hope it's pretty clear that the itch mite and the bites of the itch mite are the independent variable, and getting this gross thing called scabies. My sister Melanie had that once. It was really gross. That's the dependent variable. So I've circled that one in red. Okay, that's a primer. Hope that's review for you. Let's move on to the crucial feature of this lecture, which is what random assignment does, how clever it was of R.A. Fisher to realize just how much you can do with random assignment. I think you'll also get to read about what he said you can do with random sampling, but that's a different lecture. But random assignment is an amazing way, a very simple way, an inexpensive way to create two groups of nearly identical research participants. And if you can do that, you've gone a really long way toward eliminating all of the confounds that have to do with individual differences, like personality and age and so forth. So let's look at that. If you know that your two experimental groups in the study are identical, they're 28.2 years of age, they're 5 feet 6.2 inches tall on average, maybe one's a quarter inch taller than the other, but if the two groups are very much alike, they're both 38% Puerto Rican, okay, they're all college students, so that's equalized. If they're identical in every imaginable way, and you give them a treatment, and then they behave differently, you can be pretty confident that it wasn't the fact that they were different to begin with. Random assignment made them similar to begin with, and if they were different after your manipulation, you got rid of every possible confound if you did your study right, if your sample was big, if you used random assignment. Okay, so to answer this question, which I accidentally got a little excited and answered for you, yeah, it would not be existing individual differences. It'd be your manipulation because the groups were identical before they got your manipulation. Okay, so I believe what I found here on the web yesterday is a picture of Stacy. Well, not their real names. A picture of a kid and her grandmother. I believe the grandmother is completely white, although she might be partly African American. But this is a story about a black kid with a white grandmother. Let's just say that. So they're related a little bit, you know, the grandparent and grandkid, but they're obviously very different in age. And most people would say they're different in ethnicity. They're not different in gender. But if Stacy on the left and Shirley on the right both had COVID-19, they had the test, they definitely were ill. I corrected that and it didn't get corrected. So my apologies for that typo, but they both have COVID-19. Stacy gets a new drug and she survives. Shirley does not get the new drug and sadly she does not survive. Are you sure that the reason Stacy survived was because of the drug? Okay. I hope you're not, and hope you can tell me what the important confound is here. There's a very good reason that if they'd never gotten the drug, Shirley might have died. Sorry, that's me. And Stacy might have survived. And if you know anything about the age gradient for COVID-19, you know that people, even my age, but definitely people in their 80s, 90s, and older, are much, much more likely to die of COVID than are people who are, let's say, Stacy's 14 or 15, or maybe even if she's 11, even better. Young kids are much safer from COVID post-infection than are people like the woman we're calling Shirley, who might be here, let's say, 70, 75 years old. So there's a confound. I don't know if the drug works because Shirley was at much greater risk for dying just because of her elevated age. Okay, that's a problem. On the other hand, logically speaking, if you took these two twin sisters, and I think they're kind of famous, but I forget their names. I don't think they're identical twins. They don't look just alike to me, but identical twins don't always look just alike. I think they're fraternal twins, but imagine they are identical twins. Imagine a genetic test shows that. They both have COVID-19. Janae gets the drug and she survives. Akila does not get the drug and she does not survive. In this case, are you a little bit more confident, or maybe even a lot more confident, that it's the drug? I suspect that you are because they're the same age, they're the same ethnicity, they're the same body weight, they have the same, probably roughly the same exercise habits and diet. They grew up in the same family if they're identical twins. And so they're not identical, but they're very similar. And if two very similar people were treated differently, let's see, Janae got the drug and Akila didn't, and they behave very differently, whether it's medically or physically or emotionally, we could probably attribute that to the drug. That drug would be worth putting maybe into clinical trials now or more of them because it's a good candidate for causing the recovery of Janae because she got the drug and she recovered when her sister, who was just like her in many ways, did not. Okay, that's the logic of random assignment. I'm going to show you here the problem with not using random assignment. It's a wacky, fun example that I came up with about, must have been 2 years ago after the movie Shazam came out. I thought it was a really fun movie. I went to see it with my son, who was about 15 at the time. And so let's imagine Dr. K works for a movie studio. Um, and Dr. K said, let's do a quick study of this drug called thorine. And I'm going to give thorine to some people, and I'm not going to give thorine to other people. It's a drug, and this maybe isn't very ethical, but if the drug makes people want to see this movie, I'm going to give people free soft drinks or popcorn and sprinkle the drug in it in movie theaters or get it into the water supply and make people want to go see this movie. So in this wacky study, not a true experiment, Dr. K just found two groups of students. Maybe it's a group of students in a women's studies class, group of students in a sociology class, two different classes at the same college. He thinks they're pretty similar. One group of them gets the drug, that's thorine over here. One group of them, of course, would get a placebo. I'm sure you know what a placebo is, but just in case you don't, it's something that looks like a drug that the person is told is a drug that's actually something like a sugar pill that has no pharmacological agent that we care about in it. So in this particular study, if we look here, what happened, only 20% of the people who got the placebo, the sugar pill, said they wanted to see that movie. 70% of people who got the thorine said they wanted to see the movie. So you might want to draw the conclusion that thorine, whatever it is, maybe it gives you cancer, but it makes you want to see this particular movie, or maybe makes you want to see action movies or comic book movies in general. Who knows? But the conclusion you might want to draw is that thorine had a causal effect. There are at least two very good reasons that you can't draw that causal conclusion. And if you look at the wacky cartoons that I made for you here, these are images of people I've represented as male or female using the restroom door approach. I also am letting you know here in a colorful way that some of these people are white people. In fact, they're literally white people. My ethnicity is white, but I'm not that white, and white people aren't. But you see here that we have, oh my goodness, 6 white people in the thorium group, and literally no white people, only people of color, in this case, literally people of color in the placebo group. And if you make the assumption that we will get to later in this group that people often prefer their ethnic in group over the ethnic out group. Shazam, that actor, is a white guy. If I don't think the effect would be this big, but if for some reason people love it when the superhero is their ethnicity, if African Americans were more interested in seeing a movie where the black guy was the hero, okay, if you saw Black Panther, you know that. My guess is African Americans did go to see Black Panther at a higher rate than they went to see Shazam, for example. And it could be that people like it when the hero is a member of their in group. Okay, that's possible. If that's true at all, that's a confound. The even bigger confound, I think, though, is also pretty obvious. If we do a quick head count of people in the placebo group, every single person is female, whereas in the second condition, what is it, 7 of them, 8 of them? 8 of the people, 8 out of 10 people in the other study, in the other condition, I should say, are male. And it's not news to any of you, I think, that on average, men like comic book movies or action movies or movies that involve violence at a higher rate than women and girls do. And so that's another confound. So we can't say that thorine has the evil intended effect of making people go see movies. It just doesn't, certain kinds of movies. The data just don't tell us that at all because the study is flawed. If, on the other hand, Dr. Z ran a study and she did it properly, she got one group of 20 students from the same class, let's say it's a sociology class, and she flipped a coin 20 times or picked 20 slips of paper out of a hat, and she put 10 people in the placebo condition and 10 people in the thorium condition, gave them the drug, waited 20, 30, 40 minutes for the drug to kick in, and measured their interest in seeing this movie, Shazam. Let's imagine that she found the same pattern that the other person found. Her results, I hope you can see now, are a lot more impressive for two reasons. First of all, she did a true experiment. She used random assignment, the flip of a coin to put people in conditions. And by the way, she was incredibly lucky as well, because not only were her groups very much alike on average, but they looked just like each other. So we have here, let's see, 40% men on the left and 40% men on the right. I'm pointing as if you can see it. Yeah, 40% men, 60% women. 60% women here, 40% men here. And notice both groups are also 20% European American. They're both 20% white people. And if, let's say, the red color represents Latinos, both groups are 30% Latino or Latina. So this is a true experiment. In fact, the researcher got a little bit lucky in that she matched the groups very well. Now, it doesn't always work quite that beautifully, but yes, the goal of random assignment is to create two identical groups of people so that when you treat them differently and you observe, I hope according to your predictions, according to your theory, that they behave differently, you're pretty sure it was your manipulation, not some pre-existing difference that led to those differences. Now, it's the point in the commercial I have to say something very important. So listen carefully. I'm wearing my glasses. Yeah, I have to say this. Ask your doctor if thorium is right for you. Do not take thorium with broccoli, lettuce, carrots, corn, wheat, sugar, beans, cheese, meat, clear liquids, milk, or caffeine. Do not take thorium on an empty stomach. Thorium may increase your risk of excessive bleeding, diarrhea, concussions, joint pain, sleep disturbances, flatulence, anxiety, arthritis, violent stroke, heart attack, liver failure, paralysis, blindness, deafness, osteoporosis, and poor taste in music, clothing, and romantic partners. We always have to say that at the end or we get sued by the users of the drug. So, all right, so that's that. And we're going to move on then to actually seeing what happens with random assignment. Now, this is one of the times that teaching this course, I'm really bummed because when I get to teach this course in person, we actually do random assignment in the classroom. I get a group of 25 or 26 people and I flip a coin 25 or 26 times. We make two groups of people who go to different halves of the room. I'm sorry to say we can't do that. It's fun to do it. It's fun to see how well it works. I'm just going to have to do that with you virtually. And I will tell you that I did do this. I've done this dozens of times over the years, especially when I teach research methods, just to show people exactly how random assignment works and to show them that it works better sometimes than it does at other times. So let's do that. If you don't mind, do it with me. A long time ago now, about maybe almost 7 years ago, I was teaching still at St. Mary's College of Maryland. I was teaching research methods at a small group of 18 students. And in that group of 18 students, we did this activity. I asked them a bunch of survey questions. What's your age? What's your mom's age? What's your mom's IQ? If you don't mind saying, we're not going to give the data back to your mom. So I asked them a bunch of questions. How much do you like Lady Gaga, who is even bigger back then than she is now? And I got people's opinions on that. And then I flipped a coin 18 times, one time corresponding to each person, to put them in two different groups. And here is exactly what I got. Okay, with 18 people, I think I had 10 people in one group and 8 in the other. I could make it 9 and 9 if I wanted to. Sometimes we do that, but I think we had either 10 and 8 or maybe even 7 and 11, but two different groups of people. Okay, here's what we found. The age of these students in my control group was 20. The age of the students in the experimental group was 20.3. Those are not identical, but they're pretty darn close. 0.3 is about a third of the year. That's about 4 months. Now, if you care deeply about being 21, so you can legally consume alcohol, that's a big deal. But in the grand scheme of life, wow, random assignment did a great job. And in a minute, we'll talk about why it did such a great job on that variable and didn't do quite such a great job on some other variables. So if you look at the mother's age of these students knew their mother's ages when they reported them. Random assignment did not do a great job. It didn't do a horrible job. We didn't see an 11-year gap or a 20-year gap, but wow. In the control group, the average mother was 46. In the experimental group, the average mother was 53.1. And that tells me that most of the mothers in the experimental group had been through menopause, and most of the mothers in the control group had not. If you're doing a study of people and whether their mother has been through menopause matters, that's a problem. It's a confound. If you're not worried about that, it's probably not a confound. Now, notice the interesting thing. Their ages were almost identical, but their mothers' ages weren't. So in the experimental group, more of these kids were born when their mothers were older. Maybe they're more, maybe their birth orders are a little bit different, but the key is we matched them really well on age, but not all that well on mother's age. We matched them okay on gender, not perfect, but yeah, my class had more women than men and about 60% female, and the groups were 57% and 64% female. Ideally, we would have seen 60.5 or 61% female in both groups. We didn't, okay? I had some tall students. One of the guys in this group was 6'11 and a half. Okay, now he almost certainly went in the control group and he himself brought up the height a lot, but other people averaged out with him, led to a group that was tall but not freakishly tall. The control group was 5'9.4, at least according to their self-report. I didn't measure them. And the experimental group was about 5'8", so about an inch different. An inch 0.2 is something. You know, it might matter. It might be better to be 6'9" than 6'8" and play in the NBA, but an inch in height is not a huge difference. It's a modest difference. The IQs, if these students knew their mother's IQs, not very different. All these students thought their mothers were bright normal, about a standard deviation above the average in the control group. Same thing in the experimental group. And then finally, there was a big difference, and I was surprised at just how high these numbers were. These people were meat lovers. Let me tell you, when I asked them what's the greatest number of pork chops you've ever eaten in your life, the folks in the control group said about 5, and the folks in the experimental group said about 2.5. So on average, there were much bigger fans of pork in the control group because of dumb luck, because of bad luck here, than in the experimental group. Now, having said all that, I think I got kind of lucky here in that the two groups were relatively similar on the whole, but I would not run an experiment typically with just 18 people, because 18 people is not enough to really guarantee to any degree of confidence that I would have that my groups are really equal in almost every imaginable way. I made two groups that are pretty similar, definitely did, but they're pretty small groups. I wish they were bigger. And in fact, if I'd gotten a bigger sample, as I did when I used to teach this course at SUNY Buffalo, where my classes had sometimes 200 people in them, this particular class only had about 120, you can do random assignment there, and you'll see that it works pretty differently. And I hope you'll see with me pretty quickly here, we're going to zip through this, it works a lot better. Watch what I got here. Okay, I'm going to fly through these, but you can see that with one very small exception, even in a sample of 120 people, the folks in the control group here were a bit taller than those in the experimental group. Also a pretty tall group. I think this was more like 50 oh, I can see. In fact, it was almost exactly 50-50 male, 50.4% female in both groups. Now, one was probably 50.38, one was probably 50.42, but they were really well matched in gender. They were almost perfectly matched in mother's age. A year at age 50 is not a big deal. They were a tenth of a year, okay, so only about a month apart in age. Notice they're a little closer to 21, a bit older. Mom's IQs, both of them bright normal. The number of pork chops eaten, 4.6 in both. Now, this is Buffalo, where there are lots of meat lovers, by the way. 4.6 in both groups. So I think we can say here that random assignment did a really good job of making two groups that are practically identical, not on height, but on everything else practically identical. And I hope it's pretty clear to you that if we'd had 1,000 people or 10,000 people, when I worked at Gallup, sometimes we worked with groups of many thousands of people. If we had 10,000 people, random assignment would make two groups of about 5,000 that were absolutely indistinguishable on any imaginable dimension. Random assignment works better with a big group than with a small group. Okay, that's that. Let me ask you a couple of quick questions since I'm not doing this live with you. I won't give you too long to think about them. I have the answers on these little audio clips here. I might just clip them and rest my voice a little, but there are 5 discussion questions. Does random assignment fix things physically as well as psychologically, or does it do both? Does your sample size matter, and if so, how much? Is random assignment really ethical if you're doing a study on, let's say, a life-saving or potentially life-saving drug? Is that really ethical to flip a coin to decide who gets the drug and who doesn't? Fourth, for which confounds exactly does random assignment control? And then fifth, which I forgot to answer at first in the audio file, which of John Stuart Mills's 3 problems do experiments solve? My voice is rough enough and exhausted enough after many hours of talking that I'm going to let years past Brett answer one of these questions, and yesterday Brett will answer the others. So let's check this out. Here's your answer.
Random assignment works well for both physical and psychological dimensions. So whether you want to create 2 identical groups in terms of age, height, hand size, or knowledge of elephants, it really doesn't matter what the dimension is. Random assignment creates 2 equal or at least nearly equal groups. Sample size does matter quite a bit though. With a very tiny sample size of only 2 people, random assignment does nothing to make the 2 groups equal, but as soon as you start to get a handful of people, and once you get a very large group of people, random assignment does a fantastic job of creating 2 identical or nearly identical groups on just about any imaginable dimension. Random assignment is also a very ethical way of assigning people's conditions when you're doing very sensitive research because it does so fairly. Rich people and poor people, for example, will go into the experimental group and the control group at the very same rate. And finally, this all means that random assignment controls for any imaginable confound. That's all possible confounds.
Okay, I must have forgotten that there was a 5th point here and added it. So let's click on my after the fact answer to question 5, which I must have added. Here we go. Well, I can see that I forgot to answer question 5 for you in case you had a question about that. Experiments don't just solve the problems that random assignments solve. They solve all 3 of John Stuart Mills's problems because experiments manipulate variables. So we know exactly when some people received an experimental treatment. I must have recorded this when my family was sleeping, some people did not. And if an experiment yields any meaningful results, some people received an experimental treatment, when some people did not. And if an experiment yields any meaningful results, we see that one group behaved very differently, felt very differently, got well much more quickly than another. So if an experiment is successful and yields results that the researcher probably expected to observe, or yielded a different pattern that turns out to replicate well, they really solve all 3 of those problems. You have covariation, 2 groups look very different at the end. You have temporal sequence because you had control over when the manipulation happened. And of course, because of the power of random assignment, you know that the 2 groups were equal prior to the treatment, especially if your sample was a big one, and you know that they were different afterwards after having only been either the recipient of the treatment or the recipient of something like a placebo, a control condition where something very different happens. So yes, experiments are the only research technique that beautifully solve all 3 of John Stuart Mills's big problems. All right, I think we're getting close to the end here. Let's see. Moving along. A big strength of experiments is that they give us a lot of information about causality. You will read in chapter 3 that they do have their drawbacks, so I'm going to zip here and try to get this lecture posted as quickly as I can. But I'll also mention just briefly that experiments are not always that easy to do well because sometimes people become suspicious in the lab or they're afraid to do what they want to do because it'll make them look racist or sexist or foolish. So you often have to deceive people and do unusual things in the lab to get people to behave naturally or to do what they would want to do. And Mel Snyder's experiment that we talked about at the beginning of the last lecture is a great example of that. He gave people an excuse so that he could see that under the right conditions, people did avoid disabled people, even though they didn't do so if it was obvious that that might be what they were doing. So experiments often involve some kind of subtle deception. Okay? There are ways to address those problems. I'm not going to say much more about this because you read about this, and I want to get this lecture posted tonight as quickly as I possibly can. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. I just gave you a link here about the second quiz on this topic, but that one's also posted already on your course webpage. All right, thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you soon. Stay well, stay safe.